Welcome to Unstuck, Out of the Cave and Into Your Call. Today we're going to be discussing turning up the God volume. Many of us have asked ourselves this question: what does God sound like? I had a conversation with my little son years ago when he said, "Dad, I don't know if God has ever spoken to me. What does God sound like?" Years ago, I was invited to Hollywood, California for the production of a movie based on a biblical character. It was an animation film, the very first film that DreamWorks had put together, called Moses, the Prince of Egypt. Jeffrey Katzenberg was the director of this film. I remember sitting in a room with Jeffrey Katzenberg and several pastors, and he said the most difficult part of this entire production was, how do we present the voice of God? In other words, what does God sound like? He said they went through a lot of different ideas, from hiring someone with a big, deep baritone voice to maybe creating distortion on the voice of God so it sounded like a mighty waterfall. But finally they came up with the idea of getting 100 actors to record the same sentence and getting Val Kilmer, who played Moses, and getting his voice in there so that God sounded like 100 different voices. Well, it's not only Hollywood producers and little kids that ask, what does God sound like? I think we all ask ourselves that question. I believe that you and I need to try to figure that question out as well. Elijah was in the middle of a cave. He had stopped hearing the voice of God, and in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 11, God says to Elijah, "Elijah, come out of the cave and into my presence." I believe that when we're inside the cave of depression, of discouragement, of self-pity, of fear, it insulates us from hearing the voice of God. If you look at the passage, you'll notice that Elijah stays in the cave. I think he stayed in the cave because the voices inside of his head were louder than the voice of God. And then in this incredible dramatic display, God sends fire, earthquake, and wind. And finally it drives Elijah out of the cave. And once Elijah comes out of the cave, Scripture says that there was a whisper, a sound of silence, a gentle whisper like a blowing of the wind, and it was the voice of God. Elijah couldn't hear the voice of God when there was too much sound and noise inside of his head and around him. He had to quiet himself, and suddenly it was then in that moment that Elijah heard the gentle whisper of God. All of us have had the experience of trying to talk to someone on the cell phone where the signal is unclear, and we say, "Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?" Some of you may be asking yourself that question: God, can I hear you now? Can I hear you now? I think sometimes we need to reposition ourselves to hear the voice of God more clearly. I'm wondering today, in this small group setting, if you are hearing the voice of God. I'm wondering, when is the last time that you've clearly heard God speak to your heart and soul? I'm wondering if there's a lot of background noise that's keeping you from hearing clearly what God is saying to you. I'm convinced that hearing God's voice clearly and compellingly, the whisper of His voice, is one of the ways that God gets us out of the cave and into our call.